To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
Torrey Pines State Beach in California is a place where many come to find peace. But for two young women, it became the backdrop of unspeakable tragedy. In August 1978, police officers responded to the beach, where they found the body of 15-year-old Barbara Nantais lying in the sand. She had been strangled and beaten to death, and one of her breasts had been severed. Her boyfriend was also discovered nearby, suffering from a severe head injury that left him with no memory of the attack. 6 years later, 14-year-old Claire Hough was found just yards away from where Barbara had been killed. Like Barbara, she had been beaten, strangled, and her breast mutilated. The similarities between the two cases were undeniable. For decades, these cases remained unsolved, but advancements in forensic science have reopened the investigation, leading to new suspects and questions about the true identity of the killer. This is Forensic Tales, episode number 289, The Torrey Pines Beach Murders. Barbara Nantais was just 15 years old when her life was tragically cut short, but she was already known for her vibrant spirit and infectious personality. Described by those who knew her as fun-loving and full of life, Barbara had a bright future ahead of her. She was the kind of person who could light up a room with warmth and energy that drew people in. Her family said she was kind-hearted, someone who loved spending time with her close-knit family and friends. Though she was still so young, she had a maturity about her that made it easy to connect with her. She was a popular sophomore at her high school in Lakewood, California, and she had just made the varsity cheerleading squad. She grew up with 3 siblings, older sisters Lorraine and Sue, and younger brother Tom. She and her boyfriend, 17-year-old Jim Alt, had been dating for about 9 months. They had been introduced by Barbara's sister Sue. And just like Barbara, Jim was very popular at his high school in Long Beach. He loved to surf and swim, and he had even been featured in a wetsuit ad in Surfing magazine. Friends described him as the life of the party. So they were perfect for one another. They were the all-American couple. Jim, the blonde, long-haired surfer, and Barbara, the pretty cheerleader. It was the summer of 1978, Saturday, August 12th. Ralph and Judy, Barbara's parents, were going to be out of town for the weekend, so they had a friend come over and watch the 4 kids. But before heading out, they told the kids to behave. They said they would be back on Sunday night, don't cause any trouble. But as soon as Ralph and Judy headed out, Barbara and Jim headed to the beach. With them was Jim's friend Rick and his girlfriend Cynthia. The 4 of them went to Torrey Pines Beach in La Jolla, Southern California, where they planned to spend the night. The beach was a popular spot for teenagers, a place to unwind, hang out, and just have fun. So Barbara and her friends weren't doing anything wrong or out of the ordinary. This was a very popular beach. When they got there, the beach was crowded. So they spent a couple of hours just socializing with the other people there, and then they decided to call it a night sometime around 9:30. Rick and Cynthia decided to spend the night in their station wagon, while Jim and Barbara took a couple sleeping bags and headed to an empty spot on the beach. Not long after that, they were both asleep. Sometime around 9 o'clock the next morning, Jim woke up to a massive headache. He was disoriented. He was struggling to make sense of his surroundings. It took him a while to even realize where he was. But even through the pain, through the brain fog, he knew that something was wrong. He was alone. Barbara wasn't sleeping next to him. She was nowhere to be found. His eyes darted around, looking for her. Where was she? Was she okay? I'm freezing. I'm feeling for Barbara. Don't know where she is. I don't know anything. I can't see anything. Don't hear anything, he told CBS News. So he decided to walk up the hill to the parking lot where his two friends were sleeping in their car. His head just continued to pound, and he's having trouble even walking straight. At this point, he had no idea about the extent of his head injury. He just knew that this was well beyond a hangover or anything. Now, when he first got to his friend's car, they didn't even recognize him. His face was completely covered in blood. He looked like he had been beaten to a pulp. And he had. It would later be discovered that he had been beaten with both a rock and a log from a fire pit on the beach. Rick asked where Barbara was, but Jim said he didn't know. And that's when they ran back down to the beach to start looking for her. And it wasn't long before they found her. She was lying face down in the sand near the lifeguard station, completely naked and very obviously dead. So they grabbed their sleeping bag to put over her naked body, ran back to the parking lot, and called the police. The reality of the situation hit Jim like a wave, but his body and mind were still disconnected from the full horror about what had happened. The head injury that he had sustained, the one that left him semi-conscious and with a gap in his memory, kept him from fully understanding the gravity of the moment. He was still fighting to piece together what had happened, but nothing made sense. He couldn't recall the attack, the moments leading up to it, or even who could have done such a thing. Was there someone else on the beach after dark? Did they see the killer? Did they know what happened? He didn't have the answer to any of those questions. They had just spent a fun night together, and now they found themselves at the mercy of a very, very violent attacker. Paul Yabarando was a sergeant for the San Diego Police Department. He was also one of the first investigators to arrive on scene. When we uncovered the body, it was covered with sand, he told a reporter for CBS News as they walked along the beach where Barbara's body was found. She had some very severe-looking wounds on her head. Looked like she had probably been struck with something, perhaps the rocks that were found nearby, end quote. At the same time, police were trying to put the pieces together about what could have happened to Barbara. Jim was taken to Scripps Memorial Hospital, where he would spend the next several weeks in the ICU. He was being treated for a traumatic brain injury that would leave him forever unaware of the attack that killed his girlfriend and nearly killed him. Barbara's murder was vicious beyond comprehension. There's no doubt about it. On top of suffering multiple head injuries, including a skull fracture, she had also been strangled, sexually assaulted, and mutilated. Part of her right nipple had been cut off. Her mouth was stuffed with sand, and there were clear defensive wounds like she tried to fight back. It was as vicious and awful as it gets. Barbara's parents, Ralph and Judy, were completely devastated by the news. They were out of town, and they had no idea that Barbara and Jim had even gone to the beach that night. They thought she was home safe and sound with her 3 siblings. There were situations where I'd wake up in a cold sweat crying, said Ralph. Just the sadness at losing this child that you loved, Judy told CBS News. When you're the mom, you just carry that. I feel like I was a complete failure as a mother, end quote. They were also very mad at Jim, the boyfriend. Why didn't he protect her from this? He's the boyfriend. He's supposed to be her protector. Or could he have done it himself? But because of the severity of Jim's injuries, the police quickly ruled him out as a suspect. They might have entertained the possibility that he murdered Barbara and then hurt himself to cover it up, but that didn't make sense. His injuries were far too severe for this to have been self-inflicted. To give you an idea about the kind of injuries he had, doctors had to place a titanium plate in his head because his skull had been crushed beyond repair. There was also the psychological and emotional toll of everything. He probably blamed himself for not being able to protect his girlfriend that night or even remember what happened. He also knew that her parents blamed him for everything. Being attacked like that changed his entire life. He became depressed, even suicidal. He was never the same after that night. In the days and weeks following, detectives collected whatever evidence they could. The couple's sleeping bag, a cigarette butt found near Barbara's body, bloody rocks and firewood logs. They even took fingernail scrapings and vaginal swabs. They really hoped that some type of forensic testing could be done on any of these items that might help them find the killer. Because what else did they have? There were no eyewitnesses. Jim remembered nothing. There was no other evidence to go by. But this was 1978. DNA and forensic testing weren't very good. Police wondered if the attacker could have struck Jim first, likely hitting him over the head with some firewood. Then once Jim was out cold, he turned his attention to Barbara. He probably just saw them alone on the beach and picked them as his next victim. They also couldn't rule out the possibility that more than one person was involved. But as the weeks went by, these were all just theories and speculation. No arrests were made, not even a single suspect was identified, so the case eventually turned cold. Even though this was one of the most shocking and brutal crimes ever committed at Torrey Pines State Beach, it was far from the only one. In fact, just 6 years later, another young woman's life would be tragically taken along the same stretch of coastline, under very similar circumstances. 6 years later, 14-year-old Claire Hough's loved ones faced almost the exact same pain. She was just like Barbara, just 1 year younger, smart and spirited, and loved the beach. She just had an inner light, a joy about her. It's hard to explain unless you've met her, said Kim, Claire's best friend, who described her as very gentle, funny, kind. Claire's parents, Sam and Penny, had this to say about her. She was the class mediator, Penny said. Kids who got into arguments would ask Claire to adjudicate. Couple of times she got into trouble at school because the teacher had accused someone wrongfully and Claire wouldn't put up with it. She fought back, added her father, Sam. Claire grew up on the coast of Rhode Island and spent as much time as she could on the beach. She just loved everything about the water. She also spent a lot of time on the beaches of San Diego. Her grandparents lived just a few blocks away from Torrey Pines Beach, and it was one of her favorite places to go. So during the summer of 1984, Claire and her brother went to go stay at her grandparents' house in San Diego. Her best friend Kim also tagged along. But the night before Kim was supposed to go back home to Rhode Island, Claire had convinced her to sneak out of her grandparents' house and go down to the beach after dark. But once they got there and got comfortable near their favorite spot by the bridge, Kim said she almost instantly had a panic attack about being there. She just imagined some stranger walking up to them and hurting them. They were so exposed and vulnerable all by themselves late at night on the beach. So she made her best friend Claire make a promise. She made her promise that she wouldn't sneak out by herself ever again. 2 days later, Claire broke that promise to her best friend, and no one is sure why. Some reports say she might have gone down to the beach earlier that day, met someone, and convinced her to come down later, but that's never been confirmed. All we know is that she did break that promise to her best friend. On August 24th, 1984, her partially naked body was found by a beachcomber near the bridge. This was just yards away from where Barbara's body had been found 6 years earlier. And that's just the start of the similarities. Just like Barbara, Claire had been beaten to death, sand packed into her mouth, strangled, and sexually assaulted. And most chilling, her right breast had been mutilated. So with all of these similarities, it didn't take San Diego investigators long to wonder if they had a serial killer on their hands. Same location, same MO, same type of victims, same everything. The two victims even looked a lot alike. But unlike Barbara's case, the police had quickly identified a suspect. His name was Wally Wheeler, the beachcomber who found Claire's body. As soon as Sam and Penny heard about their daughter's murder, they went straight to Torrey Pines State Beach. And not long after stepping foot into the sand, they were approached by Wally Wheeler, a self-proclaimed psychic. And something about him just seemed off. He seemed suspicious to them. Not only had he been the one to discover the body, but he seemed to want to try to insert himself into the story. So the police encouraged Claire's parents to keep communicating with him, thinking that he might confess, or at the very least, he might be able to provide some useful information. And over the next several weeks, Wally Wheeler wrote long and rambling letters to Claire's parents, one of them saying that their daughter was coming to him in visions. No doubt the letters were odd, but when the police questioned him, he never confessed to anything, and the letters eventually stopped. And in yet another strange twist to this story, Wally Wheeler eventually committed suicide. He had thrown himself off the top of a 13-story building. After that, San Diego investigators would later tell Claire's parents that they had ruled him out as a suspect. But that didn't mean they stopped believing that he might have been involved. For many, many years after Claire's murder, they thought Wheeler was the guy who murdered their only daughter. But even through all the attention surrounding Wally Wheeler, the loved ones of the first victim, Barbara, had never once heard his name. And in fact, the families didn't even know about each other. It wasn't until years later in 2008 when the San Diego Police Department posted about the cases on their website and for the very first time publicly said that they believed Claire and Barbara had been killed by the same killer. That's when Barbara's parents found out about Claire's case. But who exactly that person was would remain a mystery for several more years until advanced DNA testing revealed two possible suspects, and one of them was one of their own. By 2012, both cases received a much-needed breakthrough, not in the form of a new witness or a confession, but through the advancements of forensic science. DNA testing, which hadn't been available or widely used during the initial investigations back in the late 1970s and 80s, DNA testing had made significant strides over the years. So in 2012, both of these cases were reopened using this latest DNA technology, including things like mitochondrial DNA testing, as well as genetic profiling. For the first time in decades, investigators began to hope that the evidence left behind at both of these crime scenes might actually lead to a promising suspect. But there was good news and there was bad news. The good news was that they were able to find a small amount of usable DNA from Claire's crime scene. But the bad news, there was nothing in Barbara's case. But still, this marked a major turning point in both of these investigations. They thought that the same person was responsible for both crimes, so if they could identify that DNA source in Claire's case, they might be able to use it to identify Barbara's killer. This potentially could hold the key to solving not just one, but two murders that had haunted Torrey Pines Beach for decades. When it came to Claire's case, the police had found two DNA hits. Blood found on her jeans was linked to a convicted rapist named Ronald Tatro. The other, a tiny microscopic amount found inside of Claire, was linked to a man named Kevin Brown. And right away, that second name, rang a bell. San Diego police knew him. They knew him very, very well. He was a former criminalist who worked in their crime lab and retired in 2002. So after making this connection, detectives knocked on Kevin Brown's front door. By this point, he and his wife, Rebecca Brown, had been married for over 20 years. He retired from the police department in 2002, and she still worked as a Catholic school teacher. Rebecca Brown told CBS News that she was getting ready for work when there was a knock on her front door. Outside were two detectives. At first, she thought they were there to talk to her husband about a case that he worked on before his retirement. Except that's not why they were there. The detectives showed Kevin a photograph of Ronald Tatro and asked him if he knew him. But Kevin said he had never met him before. Now, the investigators couldn't go out and speak to Ronald. He had died in an apparent boating accident in Tennessee in 2011. And although it was officially ruled as an accident, to this day, many people actually think it was a suicide. His wallet and glasses were found neatly sitting on one of the boat's seats. And even more suspicious, his death took place on the actual anniversary of Claire's murder. So it looked very intentional. He intentionally fell and drowned in the water. But either way, whether it was an accident or a suicide, he's dead. Kevin Brown, the retired San Diego criminalist, was now the only living suspect in Claire's murder. So that's when they showed him a picture of her. And of course, he knew who she was. Her murder was a really big deal at the time that he worked in the police's crime lab. So, of course, he knew her. But after that, investigators dropped a bombshell on him. His DNA had been found in the evidence. They didn't tell him where or how it was found. They just said that his DNA was somehow connected to Claire's murder. Later that same day, a search warrant was executed on Kevin Brown's property, looking for any evidence related to either case, either Claire or Barbara's murder. But in the end, they didn't find anything. But it was like a scene straight out of the TV show Dexter, a former crime lab employee now being accused of not just one murder, but two. But for the Browns, this was absolutely crazy. Rebecca Brown knew her husband of more than 20 years, and she maintained he's not a serial killer. But for detectives, they considered the possibility he had a darker side, a side that not even his wife knew about. Police quickly learned that at the time of Claire's murder, Kevin was a bachelor in his 30s, and he didn't exactly have the best reputation around the crime lab. To be blunt, his coworkers called him Kinky Kevin. He got the nickname because he was always going to strip clubs, so it sort of became this running joke. He also had a reputation for making his female coworkers feel uncomfortable. One of them even told CBS News about an incident where Kevin had taken a report about a very violent rape, and when she was alone in the lab with him, he read the report out loud to her and said something like, "Isn't that funny?" Then after that, she said she never felt comfortable being alone with him at work. The police also learned about his hobbies and his love for photography. Throughout the 1980s, he attended several lingerie shoots that had been advertised in local magazines. These models would essentially pose for these photographers, and then in return, they get some free photos. Kevin Brown was one of these photographers. But sometimes these photo shoots went beyond just taking a few innocent shots. Fellow photographer Rocky Ferguson, who used to work with Kevin Brown, said that sometimes certain photographers would make plans for private sessions with these models that were much racier. And according to him, Kevin did that a lot. If he liked one of these models, he would hire them for these private sessions, these private, adult, explicit photo sessions. But his bachelor past wasn't the only thing that raised suspicions. Even though he initially denied having any contact and having ever met Claire before, Kevin Brown later seemed to change his story, or at least said something that raised eyebrows. He eventually admitted to having met someone named Claire sometime in the 1980s and possibly had sex with her. But according to him, the woman that he met was much older. It wasn't a teenage girl. So according to him, it couldn't have been her. But still, it didn't look good, and it only got worse from there. Not long after the search warrant on his house, Kevin Brown agreed to sit down and take a polygraph test. The results? He failed miserably. Another thing in the police's favor was something that one of Kevin's friends had said. According to him, Kevin had called him shortly after Claire's murder and said that a girl who he had just photographed on the beach ended up dead. And he told his friend that the police were probably going to come knocking on his door and might start looking at him as a potential suspect. However, later on, the friend would deny telling the police this. So it's hard to know where the truth lies. So at this point, the police continued to build their case against Kevin Brown. And throughout that entire time, one person stood by his side, his wife, Rebecca. "I never ever thought he was a killer. Never ever," she told CBS News. "This is a man who didn't have a mean bone in his body," end quote. The Browns hired two attorneys who tried to shift the narrative that had been created about the kind of person Kinky Kevin Brown was in his 20s and 30s. If everybody who had ever looked at a photo of a scantily clad woman, if everybody who had ever went to a strip club is likely to be a serial killer, I'm afraid we're going to have to build quite a few more prisons, said one of his attorneys. We don't convict people on their character, end quote. They also pointed toward the sheer brutality of Claire's murder. They argued it had to have been committed by someone much more evil than just a guy who enjoyed going to strip clubs on the weekends. And as far as a connection between Kevin Brown, a former police crime lab employee, and Ronald Tatro, the violent convicted rapist, there was none. There was zero evidence that they had ever met before. But none of this explains one thing. How did Kevin's DNA get inside Claire? Why would his DNA be present on her vaginal swabs? To try and answer that, let's go back to the original investigation. Several vaginal swabs were taken from Claire during her autopsy. At first, the medical examiner tested them himself, looking for a match back in 1984, but there was nothing. So after that, another swab was sent to the San Diego Police Department crime lab, and that's where Kevin Brown's attorney says the trouble began. Back in the early 1980s, very little was known about DNA and contamination. So when Claire's evidence arrived at the police crime lab, most of the employees weren't following proper protocol to ensure that none of the evidence would either be destroyed or contaminated. And even though Kevin Brown didn't work directly on Claire's case, he did work close enough to the scientist who processed the evidence, including that swab where a very small, minute amount of Brown's DNA would later be found. Now, Brown's attorneys alleged that these swabs were kept out in the open without a cap. And if they were kept on a table near his workstation, then everything that was able to be airborne could have gone and touched the swab. But the problem with this case was it wasn't sweat or spit, it's his semen. How would his semen get on that swab? Well, according to CBS News, at the time of Claire's murder, scientists would often bring their own seminal fluid to the crime lab and use it to make sure that the chemicals they were using to detect semen were working as they should be. And if that's true, Brown's attorneys allege that's what happened. Kevin was doing that. Now, I know that almost sounds too bizarre to even be true, but apparently it was. They also argued that a lot of people didn't wear gloves while working, basically furthering this contamination argument. So in the end, they said there was a really good chance that Kevin's semen got on this vaginal swab while working in the lab. It was totally and completely innocent. I guess I'll leave that for you to decide whether you find that believable or not. By mid-2014, investigators were just about ready to move in and arrest Kevin Brown for Claire's murder. But before they could, a shocking twist changed everything. On October 20th, 2014, Rebecca Brown came home from work to find her husband's Bible sitting on the table. In it, he had underlined a verse about being wrongfully accused. He never came home that night. The next day, Kevin was found by park rangers near his vacation cabin, hanging from a tree. He had committed suicide. Was this a desperate attempt to evade justice? Or was this a man at the end of his rope being accused of a brutal murder he didn't commit? If you asked his wife those questions, she maintains his suicide isn't any type of admission of guilt. She says he basically had no future. He had no way out of this. If the case went to trial, it would basically ruin his reputation. Even if he was acquitted, he would stand to lose everything. But if you asked the San Diego authorities, they might say otherwise. 3 days after his suicide, the police publicly named Kevin Brown as one of the 2 suspects in Claire's murder, the other being Ronald Tatro. They wasted no time in calling him a suspect and showed absolutely no sympathy for his suicide. But since both men are now dead, no arrest on either one of them can ever be made. When it comes to Claire's family, they trust the San Diego police. And if they think Ronald and Kevin are the guys, they believe them. But instead of just focusing on the details of her murder, Claire's parents want people to remember the kind of person that she was. They don't want her to be remembered just for how she died. They want her to be remembered for how she lived. For her parents and the people who knew her, Claire will always be remembered as smart, vibrant, spirited, loving, and a defender of the wronged. She had, in their words, a lot of potential, end quote. When it comes to Barbara's case, there's a lot more unanswered questions. Since we don't have DNA in her case, some people question whether these 2 cases are actually connected or not. At the time of Barbara's murder, Ronald was in prison for rape, so we know he couldn't have been involved. So did Kevin Brown act alone? Or were both murders committed by someone else, a third-party culprit that no one knows about? Some reports even suggest that Kevin was hundreds of miles away in college when Barbara was killed. So was it impossible for him to be the guy? Have we been wrong this entire time about a connection here? Despite the promising developments in Claire's case with the DNA breakthrough, both the murders of Barbara and Claire remain officially unsolved. While the DNA evidence found inside Claire's body points towards Kevin Brown, there's still a cloud of doubt hanging over whether he was truly responsible or not, and whether his involvement extends to Barbara as well. The key forensic link between the 2 cases, DNA, was only available in Claire's case. And with no forensic evidence linking Brown to Barbara's murder, doubts about the connection between the 2 cases began to surface. Could the 2 murders be unrelated, despite the striking similarities in how they were carried out? Or was there something more, a piece of the puzzle that's been overlooked or missed in the years of the investigation? The absence of DNA evidence in Barbara's case continues to raise doubts. If Brown was truly responsible for Claire's death, why wasn't there any forensic evidence tying him to Barbara's murder as well? Could there have been another individual involved in Barbara's death? Did the forensic evidence, limited as it was, simply not tell the full story? As of now, both cases remain unsolved. Forensic advancements have shed light on Claire's murder, but the truth about Barbara's death remains elusive. The DNA evidence in Claire's case provided an important lead, but it also left investigators with more questions. Was Kevin Brown the killer, or was he merely an unfortunate link in a case that still isn't fully understood? And how, if at all, do these 2 tragic murders connect? With the forensic evidence available, there are still more mysteries than answers. But one thing is certain: Barbara and Claire's families still deserve the closure that has eluded them for so long. Until that closure comes, the forensic questions and the search for justice will remain unresolved. To share your thoughts on this week's episode, follow us on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to hear my personal take on the case, sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/forensictales. After each episode, I release a bonus episode where I share my personal thoughts on the case in more detail. Don't forget to subscribe to Forensic Tales so you never miss an episode. We release a new episode every Monday. If you love the show, please consider leaving us a positive review. It helps the show grow. You can also support the show through Patreon. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Be sure to tune in next week for a new case. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, help fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. Thank you so much to this week's newest Patreon supporter, Brandon H. To learn more, visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers: Tony A., Christine B., Sherry A., Michael D., Nicola, Megan G., Ureli, Jerry, Ann F., Carol A., Shannon D., Marianne C., Lois B., Lynn H., Ashley H., Danielle D., Chrissy D., Brett R., Luz Raquel, and Christine K. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or send me an email at courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.